Okay, so how does this have bearings for us and our seminar tonight? Essentially, we will be looking at some characters in some films which are presented as socially unwelcoming or problematic, and who perhaps people fear. Okay, and I give them a term. I just define them as people who live on the fringes of society. Okay, this is just a sampling of who these people may be, and a lot of times, you get to see these people not just in communities or societies which have got a lot of chaos, a lot of social unrest, but also in societies that are very stable, okay, societies like Singapore, okay, and some of them they act out very subtly, and some of them very overtly, okay, so it really depends on what type they belong to and what are their goals and objectives in belonging to that category. Okay, so when we talk about alterity or otherness in film, what we really want to do, and I believe this to be a large part of what the filmmakers would have in mind as well, it is to think about who or what belongs to the other, and how these people may not necessarily just belong to a group of people that we do not want to be associated with. It is an attempt to challenge what we believe to be normal, okay, or usual, and to get us to think about alternatives and alternative possibilities. Okay, so what did you just see in the film? Is that something that you are familiar with, or that you have seen before? Or for that matter, have you seen this chap before? So what do you call people like you? In Singapore, you see them sometimes, buskers, and what do they do for a living?
They entertain, provide street entertainment for the living.
So it could be anything, right? In his case, he's juggling balls, he's making some music, he's trying to dance with his feet, keeping his feet in step, making some rhythm. But sometimes you get people who are just there to sing, sometimes they're just making music, sometimes they have a certain skill that they would like to show you, and sometimes they may even be painting, drawing, doing other artistic things. Okay, but essentially, these are the people who try to gain a living by doing or performing something for the community. Okay, and even this aspect of Singapore has gone through a lot of sophistication, because they never used to be registered or licensed. Okay, and they will just come out from somewhere, and then they will start to perform on the streets, and if you're happy, you just throw a few coins or a few dollar notes for them. But nowadays, you can't just be a busker even if you want to, because you have to go through the government, and you have to be lawfully registered before you can do something. Okay, and the point is that well, I suppose there are pros and cons with the initiative or starting to get people to register themselves before allowing them to do all these things, because that means there is regulation, right? And that means these people are being accounted for, and they are being looked after by, say, the Ministry of Manpower, okay, or whoever is overseeing them. But on the other hand, it also means that no longer can you just be a busker, and it means
if you are not willing or you are not able to navigate your way through this bureaucracy, and you do not know how to fill up forms, for instance, or you do not know how to access the internet, then it might mean you have to look somewhere else to find your livelihood, right? Because this job may not be suitable for you anymore in Singapore. Okay, I think the choice of Tan Bing Bing focusing on this old man and showcasing what he's capable of doing, it's not so much to give him a chance to perform as much as it is to get us to start thinking about certain things like that. Okay, where have I seen these performances before, and what do they mean to me? How many times did I actually stop and appreciate them, or maybe even give some money to them? Yeah, and if I have never done that before, why is that the case? And in the future, will I actually consider doing that now that I have this person in my frame of mind? Yeah, so things like that, when you start having that dialogue with yourself, then you start actually appreciating them more, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. And this is one of the ways films like this can do that for us. This film by Royston Tan, and it's titled 15, and it features teenagers who are kind of social rejects, and they go through a series of trials, tribulations, lived experiences, and not necessarily growing any wiser at the end. Okay, but it's definitely a social commentary on some of the youth in Singapore and how they have developed to become in our present day society. Anyone used to be like them when you were younger? Now, in this very short clip, right, I find that there are a lot of things to be said and also a lot of things to reflect on. First of all, I found it interesting that Royston Tan, he chose to make this scene in this way where there's this merry-go-round. I mean, literally they were on a merry-go-round, but he was panning or maybe he wasn't panning the camera, but he was using some computer effects, and whatever the final product, you see them moving around and around, and the world is spinning and going around while they are having this conversation. And the most famous, I would say, and the most immediate sequence that came to my mind was the R&J sequence, Romeo and Juliet sequence that was being done, and it was kind of like similar in that they had this first meeting, and the two of them were looking at each other, and then the world was going around them as well. And I think the whole point of this really is to find some kind of way to create this surrealism where there's this certain degree of not real, or this conversation being something that is kind of fantasy / reality, but at the same time, whatever they are talking about is actually very real. And I mean, to the boys, it was life-threatening, right? Because if they did not pass their maths test, then they would be punished in very severe ways. And this concern of theirs manifested and then became a very philosophical conversation for the three of them. Okay, talking about things like career, life choices, getting married, and then staying on as friends, and all these things that come to pass while they were talking. It just reflects how mundane yet at the same time important this conversation was to them. Okay, and you see many different directors, trying their hand at featuring people like that. So the most obvious one that comes to mind would probably be Jack Neo, and his films "I Not Stupid" series, and how the boys inside those films also were not academically inclined, and a lot of times their parents would punish them because they didn't do well in school. Okay, and it just speaks of a very real problem in Singapore, I think, when it comes to academics, and specifically how well you perform in school. Okay, and really this concern is not only the purview of these boys who are clearly not academically strong. Okay, it's a concern even for the best students we have in Singapore. And back to the main subject of today's seminar. So these boys, clearly they are social rejects because they are not capable in terms of their academics. And in school, we have already a taste of what that means. She's very young, and already she has made a lot of films, mostly short films, and exploring many different things. Okay, so I would like to start with a quote from her, and this was taken from an interview that Objectives did with her. So she says that the more she lived, the more I realized that life, in some ways, is somewhat ridiculous. Not in a bad way, but the way life unfolds is so unpredictable to the point of being slightly absurd. And I think what arrested my attention when I read this interview and this particular line is it really captures the essence of her films, the kind of issues that she likes to explore, the kind of style that she has stamped onto her film or her films. Very aptly, the idea of what's right and what's wrong, okay, especially in a society like Singapore. So, of course, the police, they are there to do a job, right? They have a very important job to do, and there's nothing we can say to fault them for what they are doing. So then the question would become, what could the granny have done? Yeah, and that's where the power of the film comes in, precisely because it doesn't give in to what we expect will happen to the Rohingyan girl, because that's not the reality of things. So in our reality, someone like the girl needs to be deported, and that is seen to be the thing to be done in the narrative, right? And if you think about this, the dynamics that gets played off between the two protagonists, so in this case, the granny and the child, then you start to realize who is the other here. Okay, even that starts to become blur, because at first you could imagine the Rohingyan girl being the other quite clearly, because she comes from another place, and then she's trying to find a way to get onto Singapore and then maybe continue her life here. And she is an illegal migrant, right? Trying to get onto the island. Okay, but then you think about the granny, and you start to contemplate, okay, the granny, she's old, she stays on not the main island but Pulau Ubin, and then she lives in a place which is kind of caught between two worlds, right? The main island, which is Singapore, is prosperous, is developed, it has a lot of things, a lot of infrastructure that is missing on Pulau Ubin. And Pulau Ubin, how is it going to sustain itself, or where is it going to go from here? If it persists and it doesn't change, then there's a risk that it will become obsolete. It will no longer be relevant. And if it pushes forward and it changes, then it might be too much for that very small island, right? It might not be relevant either to make it into another Singapore. Okay, so the granny is kind of caught in between, in a world that's in a dilemma of its own. So, very interestingly, you get to see Kirsten Dunn doing this and kind of capturing the other in a home that may belong to another person that is not belonging to the main community. And I think that's where people like us, when we watch it, we start to think about it a bit more. And of course, the other very interesting thing you should note would be the language used. Right? So many different languages, showcasing the diversity of Singapore and how perhaps in the past, really something that may not be happening anymore here in Singapore now, but in the past people tend to speak a lot of languages, Malay, some dialects of Chinese, and then maybe even a little bit of English from time to time. And the last film that I want to actually talk about here is this film called Tanjong Ru, and it features a place in the east of Singapore, and previously used to be a hotspot for homosexual men to gather and then have escapades and stuff like that. And in the history of Singapore in 1993, there was an entrapment to capture some of these men who patronized the place, and 12 homosexual men were captured and subsequently jailed and caned for public misconduct, right? And this is an imaginary story of one of those men. And so I'm going to show you a very short segment of it where the protagonist talks about his experience and also how he felt after being caught and subsequently jailed or punished for doing what he did. Misrepresentation or confusion in our normative perception of what sexuality is, and it prevents us from seeing the possibility that there can be more than just the male and the female sex. And I think in this film, what is being treated very cleverly is this homosexual man who, apart from his sexuality, actually has not done anything wrong, even when it comes to the context of society and what it expects of us. So that is why he repeats a few times in that sequence, and he says, I have no regrets, I don't think I did anything wrong, and more importantly, there is no one for me to blame. Who do you want me to blame? What do you want me to blame, right? And so I think when filmmakers, they explore such issues, they actually allow us to look into ourselves and then to consider what is society's perception of right and wrong. So in this case, because of our penal code, there is a certain law that states there should not be any homosexual activity or tendency for any sex in public, and this becomes something that gets regulated in our society. in a way that maybe the police officers who are doing their job may not so religiously reinforced if they were given their own autonomy to do what they think is true or is right for them. So in this case, do we fault the police officer for doing their job and for setting up this entrapment and for capturing these men? Or do we fault the law for it? Okay, so to conclude today's seminar, essentially we started off looking at how things get dichotomized in society, and not just by society, but because of the way we see the world, right? It sometimes get easier for us to just say this is right and this is wrong, and this is true and this is false. And just like night and day, you get to see that very clearly. But when you move from that to something that is a little more fluid, right? In this case, when you look at light and darkness through this concept, of them being two of the same thing, right? And not just two separate entities, then you start to see that maybe light needs darkness and darkness needs light in order for them to exist. Right? And this is essentially what allows us to then tolerate and eventually accept multiple perspectives. And this is, of course, the core of what I wanted to tell you in today's seminar.